Whew, good morning, February 18th, 2019. Welcome to episode 7 of Afrolantican Jurisprudence, 6,000 years of African statehood and commitment to extraordinary commitment to equal protection of law. This particular episode, we're going to talk about African cultural unity, matrilineality, and the Queen Mothers of Kemet. The last episode we discussed women in ancient Kemet, matriarchy, the female queens, um, the doctors, and even tracing it back to the ubiquity of female gods in their equal rank with men or male deities. So this is a natural progression from there because even I think we went 2 hours, or I went 2 hours talking about that because it's so much. We still left out a lot, and I really want to talk about the Queen Mothers of Kemet, or the God's Wives of Amen, the God's Wives of AmenRa, and their role as Queen Mothers of Kemet, basically Big Mama. And it's a way to explain what I mean by matrilineality. I've used that term several times when it comes to property succession, when it comes to power succession as far as kings and queens are concerned, and distinguishing it from patrilineality that you're probably most familiar with, where the father is the head of the family and property passes from the father to the usually what they say primogenitor, or the eldest son. That's a European or Asian concept. And it's interesting to see in the history of Kemet where we notice a battle of 3,000 years or 4,000 years or even longer than that between who's in control of trade and taxes and whatnot, whether it's the African South or the Mediterranean North. And we see, and if we understand matrilineality versus patrilineality, it becomes a lot clearer when you're reading the history of the Nile Valley to assess its more or less racial components, or Africanness versus Asianness, however you want to describe it, or even Europeanness. Again, I'm Andre Smith, Professor Bonton, Smitty Bonton. Call me all types of things, but not whatever. So we're going to continue the discussion, have a little fun. Let me just remind you of where we went from the beginning. We talked about the ubiquity of African statehood, that there are over 20 states in Africa prior to our colonialization. And when we say state, we mean a central government that, excuse me, with a bureaucracy that controls several provinces, usually with different ethnic groups, by taxes and military force, and a redistribution system called African feudal taxation. And so we're starting at the very beginning, and they're going to talk about almost, or at least mention all these states and how there is an African cultural unity as far as not just spirituality, not just as far as customs and social culture, but also as far as political institutions as well, because we're looking backwards to see what we might pick up there that we missed because we're not taught this stuff. See what we can pick up from those four or bygone eras, and see what might we adapt towards the future, towards the better system. Again, we're not looking for necessarily the black system. We're looking for the better system. Okay. So let's talk again about this idea that African statehood and political institutions have had an extraordinary commitment to equal protection of law, represented by an extraordinary commitment to the fair treatment of class, religion, gender. And so we've been talking about gender a lot. And here I want to make clear, when we're talking about culture and statehood and political life, religion and whatnot, they all come together. I am not that much of a spiritual person per se, as far as church and worshiping a particular deity. But that's the interesting thing about that is I feel like that's consistent with African tradition, in that I recognize all of the ancestors and their importance and their continued importance and guidance in our future endeavors. So, with that said, I still take a more, or we're taking, at least in these videos, a more earthly, political, legal, economic view. And so, tying spirituality to those things, we do it again through taxes. Again, it's very interesting to me that I've gotten so far as African history and theory and jurisprudence through taxation, which I think most people think is fairly distinct. But again, taxes being the sine qua non of the state, that which the state pretty much can't do without. It's very much tied to religion, or at least it was, especially in ancient Kemet, because who represents God also represents the earth that you're living on. And that authority, the thankfulness for your life itself, and where you're staying, and the agriculture and the food that you eat, the sun that comes up and shines, that is the person or the deity or the entity that has the authority, or whoever represents that deity has the authority to lay taxes and collect taxes amongst the people in appreciation for the stewardship of this world. And we see that in Africa, that it's split between, again, the male and the female, where the woman as queen mother represents the earth or the farm or law or justice or what have you, that it's the male figure that acts. So again, I mention all the time that Mot, the female goddess Mot, represents truth, justice, balance, harmony, order, etc. However, it's Thoth who is the action figure and judges and weighs the soul against the feather of Mot, right? And we see that in played out in society, especially in antiquity, that the land in Africa belongs, it's often said, to the king or whatever, but it really to Big Mama, right? That the person, the queen mother, is the representative of this earth, Mother Earth, and then it is men as king who are to be the stewards of it. And so the point I'm trying to make is identifying with that queen mother becomes paramount in African societies, where it is almost irrelevant in Asiatic or European societies, right? So to have the authority, be given the authority to be chosen by the queen mother as official, as legitimate, gives this person, this pharaoh, this king, even priest or whatnot, the authority to represent this land, and most especially at these times, to then go about with the armies, with the of the state, to tour, and on the one hand hear disputes and resolve disputes, but on the other hand to collect taxes. Those taxes are brought to the state. The state then, with the surplus of food, the surplus of wares, then has building projects like the Sphinx, like the pyramids or whatnot, and then pays the food out, or what was the revenues out, to those workers, making society grander and greater and more impressive and more attractive, right? And brings greater trade. So that's how it all, religion, taxes, and all that work together. And religion being, the word religion meaning tie back. Who is the governing god or goddess, the preeminent god or goddess, often tells you a lot about who the people think they are, right? The origins of this people, the origins of the people tend to mirror their the deity and how that deity was initially accepted, created, constructed, however you want to put it. Okay, so this confluence between religion and politics and law is more intense in the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And I say this with respect to the presence or the emergence of the gods' wives of Amun, the gods' wives of Amen-Ra. And I believe that these are more or less the queen mothers of Kemet. And it's interesting to me because I think the story of Kemet can be told in a cleaner, crisper fashion if Egyptologists, of which I'm not one, but as someone who reads their work, it would seem it would be clearer if they would follow the queen mothers and determine describing the changes from dynasty to dynasty to dynasty, because as we know, a dynasty means a different family. But what does that mean? And in Africa, that means a queen mother who is not unrelated to any of the former, not through the female line, not the male line. That's known as far as distinguishing from dynasty to dynasty, but it's not taken seriously when someone writes a book or describes how Kemet or Egypt progressed from 4000 BC to, let's say, 500 AD. Its peaks to its climb. So we're going to do that here, or at least try to do that somewhat. And when we get to the New Kingdom, we really get a sense of how powerful the gods' wives of Amun were, and how much the existence of the state and how much control over taxes and trade depended on whether the gods' wives of Amun were seen as legitimate or not. Many of them were pharaoh's wives. They were the queens. Many of them were co-regents, meaning during the Egyptian empires, the pharaoh was probably most responsible for the north, lower Egypt, the Levant, Syria, Turkey, while the queen was more respected in the south. And Egypt extended in certain times all the way from Nubia to Punt, which we believe is Kenya. And Amun becomes this central figure, especially for Africa, right? For the African interior and the desire to control Egypt from the south, from Thebes, from Upper Egypt. That Amun that becomes from one of the minor gods in the Old Kingdom. I'm sorry, I'm a little under the weather, which is why it took so long to come out with this next video. So you'll have to pardon me if I have to take a second to get back on track. Hold on. So under the we know that Narmer conquers Upper and Lower Egypt. He comes up from the south and unites Upper and Lower Egypt to become the first dynasty. What's not as often talked about is that when we talk about the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and even times thereafter, we see repeatedly the 11th dynasty, the 18th dynasty, the 21st dynasty, the 25th dynasty. All of these dynasties come after so-called intermediate periods where Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt splits. And it's almost always, or at least the 11th, 18th, 21st, 25th, the Theban dynasties, the dynasties closest, the families in the cities closest to Africa that come up from the south to attach Lower Egypt, to make Lower Egypt pay its taxes to the king. Now, when we get further past the New Kingdom, then the situation switches. That the northern capitals of Egypt, the Mediterranean Delta, once it becomes Assyrian, Persian, Greek, etc., is now trying to control the south and make the south pay taxes to it. However, that is not often, well, it's contested. I'm not going to say it never happens, but it's very contested. And so Pharaonic culture and the old Egyptian Commission culture moves further south. But we're going to, this empire, now note that this empire of Amun, a lot of people know that, again, the phrase amen or whatnot seems or may derive from Amun or Amen-Ra. It's written so many different ways. you almost kind of think that's intentional, that it's written so many different ways that if we could choose one, maybe it would bring the deity back. But it's so Amon is also written Amon. It's sometimes written Ammon, Amen, um, Amun, Amun. So whenever you see these different deities discussed in different books, know that it's all the same god that came basically from Thebes, one of the southern cities in Upper Egypt, and it represents once again not just the male, but Amon is the male deity. Mut is his female counterpart, right? Again, monogamous relationship, and they have a son named Khonsu. Then we can talk about Montu later. During the Old Kingdom, this was just one of the gods. Again, it's an earlier time. Thebes is becoming more important. Thebes, earlier known as also Waset. And the interesting thing about Thebes is one of the reasons it's so important and so enduring is there is not only is it on the Nile. Okay, we got the Nile going from the Mediterranean north, going up. Remember, the Mediterranean is low, right? Then it goes up, or the water comes down the Nile from Ethiopia to Nubia, down to Egypt, down to the Mediterranean. So there's trade all the way through the Nile River. That's the essence of the trade. That's the essence of agriculture. The fact that it supports agriculture more than any other place in, let's say, Saudi Arabia or the Levant or whatever, makes it such an attractive place. But also, Waset or Thebes has a road that's been established that goes to the Red Sea. So once the Egyptians or the Cometians can now get to the Red Sea and trade all the way down through Ethiopia, Punt, which is Kenya, then the empire becomes even greater. We know that the southern trade is much more dynamic and much more important in most instances than the northern trade. The south is where the gold is, right? In Nubia and whatnot, the gold is typically not within Egypt, even though Egypt has this wealth of gold and is so attractive because it. The copper, the limestone, all these other things are grabbed from other places, and Egypt becomes the center point. Thebes is one of the major center points, especially coming from the African South. So as Thebes rises and the god of Thebes rises, Haman rises, not just within Kemet, but when it rises to the level of empire with Queen Hatshepsut, we see Amon ubiquitously, right? So then we have Baal Amon, Zeus Amon, Jupiter Amon, right? Amen-Ra, all right? So Amon becomes, and Amon means he who is hidden, or that which is hidden. So even though, so all these other gods, they blended because those gods have, human figures or representations, but Amon is always behind the scenes, right? And that becomes the god of the world for a moment, but then as that retreats, a god of Black Africa. We'll talk about Akhenaten, who is praised as a monotheist, but from an Afrocentric perspective, his promotion of the Atan is inconsistent and seemingly economically harmful to African control of Kemet, and we'll talk about that pretty soon. So, the God's wives of Amon, right? God's wife, Amon's wife, right? Who that woman is becomes the figure that's venerated throughout the kingdom, throughout the empire. And so being able to represent that woman is what allows the male or the king to have authority. You can just imagine Hatshepsut, who is just dripped in gold on horse and chariot, going through these lands all the way from the south to the north, with these parades, these festivals, these singers. Each king or pharaoh, especially the queen, had what's called a harem or a convent, and one of the major components of it was a choir, an orchestra, and dancers, right? basically a beehive, right? Queen Bee had her beehive, and when they went out strutting and strolling, everybody was, I don't want to say bowed down because it seems like subjugation, but celebrating. Like, this is the epitome of the nation, the epitome of woman, of the queen mother of this nation, and all the goodness thereof. And these women, these guards' wives of Ammon, not only do they become wives of the Pharaoh, not only do they become pharaohs themselves. Nefertiti is probably a god's wife of Ammon and also a pharaoh after the death of or the rule of Akhenaten. They also will end this with the harem conspiracy. A harem is a convent. A harem has nothing to do with sex. A harem is a convent where the god's wife of Ammon and the high priest of the god's wife of Ammon rules over lots and lots and lots of land, which again collects taxes, and becomes exceedingly wealthy, and a challenge to the pharaoh, and able to make the pharaohs or the kings respect them, especially when the gods' wives of Ammon come to represent the southern half of the empire versus the kings such as Ramses and whatnot, who move the capital city up north to Memphis, up to Avaris and the Delta. And when you have the split in the empire between the northern half and the southern half, the gods' wives of Ammon, some of them act as co-regents, or the ruler of the south, while their cohort rules the north. And I say cohort specifically because on the one hand we can say they're married, on the other hand we can say that they were king and queen. On the other hand, sometimes it doesn't seem like there was a sexual relationship at all, that we had the rule of brother and sister, or at least in name, the royal sisters. I know a lot of historians say that certain pharaohs married their sister. I think it's more accurate to say governed with their sisters, while they took wives from the provinces that they had conquered. Many Asian provinces, they would marry those princesses, but those princesses did not have any claim to being God's wife, right, of Ammon. They had no authority there. Again, from a matrilineal system, me bringing in a woman from outside has nothing to do with the queen mother and her daughters that will then become the legitimate authority, and the people that they attach themselves to represent become the authorities that can then tax and control Kemet and whatnot. Again, I apologize, I'm a little under the weather. Okay, so let's talk about some of these gods' wives of Kemet. We see God's wives appear in the Middle Kingdom. First of all, we see a lot of female pharaohs in the Old Kingdom. We know that Neith was a pharaoh, Mer-Neith, Neith-Hotep, and then the very last pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, the 6th dynasty, Nitocris. Now, her story is interesting because we don't know. There may be some Syrian connection or something like that, but we know that there's several female pharaohs by name and actually pharaohs in the Old Kingdom. So when we hear that later, it doesn't take for me when we hear this idea that a female pharaoh is offensive to at least the African South. It may be offensive to the Asiatic North in later years, but I don't see how it could be offensive to the African South based on the matrilineal system and based on the fact that there were female pharaohs in the Old Kingdom. Okay, but the queens of the Middle Kingdom, there's only one named female pharaoh, that's Sobek-Neferu. However, this is where this idea of the gods' wives of Ammon starts to take shape, right? It becomes an official position, the high priest of Ammon. And one of the reasons is because after the Old Kingdom dies off, Egypt doesn't die. There's a 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th dynasty, but they only rule in the south. And so there's the north, again, the lower Egypt has left the fold. They are no longer part of the crew. And so they're not, and when I say that, what do I mean? They're not paying taxes. They're not contributing to the state. The authority has waned. And so, and we also, when we talked about the teachings of Ptahhotep, we saw that when the authority broke down, crime, corruption took over the state and made things miserable for everybody. And so Aman at that point, the princes of Thebes, the princesses of Thebes, all seem to unite not only Upper Kemet, but also Nubia and Punt to this southern half of the empire. One of the things, Queen Hatshepsut is noted for her expeditions to Punt, which I believe means that she went personally to collect the taxes and assert the authority of the empire there. It's known that trade with Punt goes all the way back to the Old Kingdom. So trade with Kenya from Egypt, and who knows how further south that goes, because we'll talk in later episodes about Kenya, Sofala, the East African coastline, and its great history. We're going to talk about that after we finish discussing the Nile Valley. So Amon becomes this representation, or as Diop would, Sheikh Anta Diop would say, more or less the god of Black Africa at that point. We know that then that connection between Upper Egypt, Nubia, Punt, Ethiopia, which the Greeks all put together and just called Ethiopians, the sunburnt people, the dark-skinned people, that culture then flows through Nubia with Meroe, Napata, all the way to the rest of Africa over the next several thousand years, right, through what we call the Bantu migration, right? The Bantu migration has two components, the eastern side, the western side, and there's reason to believe that both of those sides had their initial introductions to statehood and governance from the Nile Valley. Okay, so as the Middle Kingdom reasserts itself for a certain amount of time, the Mentuhoteps, the Amenemhets, Mentu is also, or Montu is a warlike god, and so they're fighting back from the north, right? The Old Kingdom has these pyramids, the Sphinx dripped in precious metals, they gleam, they shine. The wealth of Egypt is everywhere, and so it is attracting these foreigners, or Asiatics as they're described most often. And now those folks are seemingly taking control, or at least the upper half, the lower, what we call Lower Egypt. So under the authority of Amon and the gods' wives of Amon, we have the reassertion of power. Now, that happens for a while, but the Middle Kingdom falls to a people called the Hyksos. The Hyksos, on the one hand, they are described as quote-unquote shepherd kings. They're not coming from the West. They're not coming from Greece or Europe. They're coming from Levant, Palestine, Syria, and whatnot, or that's what's believed. And they establish a city in the Eastern Delta, Avaris. And we believe that they more or less committed real acts of atrocity, slavery. They had horse and chariots, right? And so up until that point, African archers were the greatest warriors. The Medjai warriors, the Nubian Medjai warriors, were the greatest military force in the ancient world. So that's, again, how we're going to get this empire rolling. But we also recognize that somewhere up north, northern Asia, the Caucasus Mountains, and who knows where, somebody jumped on the back of a horse and turned that horse into a fighting vehicle. Add the chariot with the wheel, etc. The Hyksos come down from the north, and they more or less use that military power to subjugate Kemet and possibly even Lower Nubia. In certain instances, it may not be just a conquering, more so that the Hyksos get to sail their ships all the way to Nubia to extract the gold without Kemet being able to tax them, attack them, etc. Because they don't try to take over the system. They don't try to change the system. They don't try to inject their gods, they recognize the sophistication of the Egyptian legal structure and try to basically take it over from the inside. And they do. But the memory of the Hyksos and these wicked Asiatics, as they're often called, reverberates everywhere. And so in Africa, so this, or Northeast Africa, the Nile Valley. So expelling the Hyksos, kicking them out of Kemet, becomes a national or international, actually, cause célèbre. And the warfare, we believe, is intense. And I think one of the interesting things about this warfare, we have central figures named Kamos, Akmos, and his wife Akmos Nefertari, is that if we can imagine several dynamics of foreign slavery, the war to expel them, the death toll amongst the men during slavery itself, and then also the war of liberation, that we might see, it might become more easily to accept why, or understand why, 18th dynasty women become exceedingly powerful, and it's not even clear whether Egyptologists are willing to give them their fair due, to give them their, to recognize their full equality with men, if that's what happened. There's evidence to suggest as much. It's hard to say. We know that they have a more venerated position than anywhere else in the world. We know they have a more venerated position than any other women, more or less, in Egyptian history. But whether they had totally equal rights is interesting. We can't say that for sure, but we can say it is extraordinary. And I want to use that word often, that it's we don't need it to be perfect, but we know that it is extraordinary. So the first God's wife of Amun of the New Kingdom is Akmos' wife, Akmos Nefertari. And not only is she the first God's wife of the 18th dynasty, the first basically queen mother, the first big mama of the dynasty of Kemet, there's actually a contract, right? There's actually a contract that describes precisely how much that her harem, and again, harem means convent, that she is to be in control of the church. Basically, the black, Amun is the black church, right? Think of it as AME, and let's say society broke down, or we felt really strongly about being taxation without representation from the United States, and many of us started to only pay our taxes to the black church, right? And if the black church were strong enough to resist the state for taxation, it would cause a lot of controversy. Well, that's what's happening here, right? But to pay off the church is paid by the state, or the God's wife of Amun is paid a certain amount, great amounts of silver, gold, food, etc., totally supplying their convent as a compensation for joining a coalition to govern Kemet, because again, without their stamp of approval, there is no taxes coming from Kenya, from Nubia, from upper Kemet, from Upper Egypt, and that is a lion's share of the wealth of the state. So when we get to Hatshepsut, she is not only God's wife, she calls herself God's wife, she's God's daughter. She is, for most people understand that she is a pharaoh, a king or a queen in and of herself for several years. Through the reigns of Thutmose, she lasted through Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, and again, this new technology, the horse and the chariot, is adopted by Egypt. We take what was used to conquer us, and now it is being used by Thutmose I, II, III, and Hatshepsut to create an empire, not just a kingdom, but an empire that stretches all the way from Kenya to Greece, right, through Turkey, through Syria. I know they don't want to admit it. Again, Eurocentric scholars don't want to admit that Mycenae is Mycenae before it's Greece, or Athens and whatnot. But the Mycenaean people, all the pictures of them in Egypt, and there are several, are of so-called tribute bearers. Now, Egypt scholars will say, well, they established trade relations. Yeah, well, that's how trade back then went through the state. It was through taxation. I am going, uh, uh, Mycenaeans, Hittites, the folks in Turkey, Syria, and whatnot, they were pretty good at metallurgy, had a lot of silver. And so you often see them as tribute bearers bringing vases, big metal vases to Egypt. And what they would take back is then the products of southern empire from Africa and Kenya. And they would take those things back to Mycenae or Greece, whatever. So it was trade, but we know that that's taxation in the African world. That my power to tax is to take a certain percentage and not take, you're going to bring it to me because I have the authority, not just spiritually but also militarily. You're going to bring me what I require from the best of what your province produces, and then I am going to then return to you portions of what the other provinces produces, and that way the whole of the empire has a sophisticated and diverse amount of goods. That way you have it's called, that's how we're going to take a caste system and create a more diverse economy. I mentioned there's an interesting thing about Hatshepsut as God's wife, and then God's daughter, and then the Pharaoh in her own right. It's with her reign that we really need to ask questions about how equal black women were. She has an advisor, right? A trusted advisor named Senenmut, Senenmut, and is widely recognized that Senenmut is an Asiatic, right? That he is not Nubian or from Upper Kemet or whatever. So on the one hand, we have Hatshepsut representing equal protection as far as women is concerned, as far as gender. But to the extent she also has her most trusted advisor, a bureaucratic advisor, he's not named necessarily as a vizier, although he may have been, is an Asiatic. And we also, again, have this idea of equal protection of the law as facilitating this empire, as facilitating what's called an advanced state, where the highest positions are based hopefully on merit rather than your allegiance to the ruling ethnic group. But there's some other questions about Senenmut, like, and again, it's questions. I don't have the answers to them, and it doesn't seem like other folks want to know. And so there is a question of whether Hatshepsut is not only is she a queen, does she choose her husband? Is she choosing the king? Are women at such a power at this point in time that they get to choose, that they recognize themselves as the authority, as the spiritual, political authority to whom people are going to pay their taxes. And with that authority, I choose who of you in the north I will allow to rule the north. I got the south, right? God's the wise of Ammon, we got the south. Or at least the high priest of Ammon. And again, I don't want to leave them out. There are men figures. There's high priests of Ammon. And so the competition between the two needs to be investigated as well. But this idea of Senenmut being a trusted advisor, possibly a husband, may explain why Thutmose III, her grandson, is accused of trying to erase her name from all her accomplishments. Is it because she chose her husband? Is it because he's Asiatic? Did they feel as though she had sold out the empire by creating it so great, but at the same time the African South feels as though it has a lesser position now that papyrus and other items of the north are becoming just as valuable, right? Another question I have about Senenmut is Senenmut a woman? That's another thing I don't think I've seen anyone really ask. Senenmut, M-U-T, typically represents, again, we know Ammon is the male deity, Mut is his wife, right? And so for her advisor to be named Senenmut, I don't know. is she is Senenmut not only her chief advisor, is she a woman as her chief advisor? Um, you will leave it at that. There's so much to be investigated, and if we look at things from a matrilineal perspective, uh, I think it becomes clearer how interesting these things are. Now, after Hatshepsut and Tutmos III, um, the kings, this empire um, that has been created. Now, it's great to have a lot of wealth, but at the same time, maintaining that wealth sometimes requires decisions that may be inconsistent with equal protection, may be inconsistent with concept of Ma'at, meaning we may have an era after Hatshepsut where Egyptian rule over those areas become more oppressive, right? And including slavery and becoming autocratic, and that the kings of Egypt start to refer. This is now when the kings of Egypt start to refer to themselves as gods. And that's important because, again, we were taught that Egyptian kings were gods, or they were revered as gods. And I've tried to show that in the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, or whatnot, it's just not that. They're just, it doesn't. I don't believe that they are that powerful as a matter of rule. However, when we get to Akhenaten, when we get to other, especially Ramses in the 19th dynasty, then we have autocratic rulers who don't care what the priests of Amun say, who want, and as a matter of fact, that's where we get, they start to appoint God's wife. That they seem to, the Ramses, the Hatshepsuts, the Ramses, the Akhenatons, they seem to believe that they have the power now to marry a Asiatic princess and make that Asiatic princess God's wife of Amun. And once that happens, that's when Egypt almost entirely falls apart and then is put asunder by the Assyrians, the Greeks, and Romans, etc. So after Hatshepsut, right, she Akhmos Nefertari, God's wife, Hatshepsut, God's wife, and these women are just so venerated. Their images are everywhere. But then becomes another line of 18th dynasty God's wives that are just amazing, right? We have Tari, and again Nefertari, Tia, Te, Toya, Titi, Nefertiti, Queen T, and there's a couple Queen T's, Maritamud and Mary, right? So these are lines of women who are more or less related to each other, grandmother to mother to granddaughter, etc. And their prominence, the idea that they have authority, is what keeps the southern part of the empire more or less in check. However, as I just mentioned, Akhenaten, when we have these irregularities of succession, it also shows a cultural and economic decline, right? Especially decline in the South's ability to control. So Akhenaten, right, the famous religious reformer, who basically says we're going to get rid of all the ancient gods, and particularly Amun, right? So on the one hand, he's a religious reformer. On the other hand, a lot of people could consider him a sellout or whatever, because he moves the capital north. He makes the worship of Amun, the god of Black Africa, basically illegal, and then sets up the Aten, right? The Aten is really his dad, and then he and Nefertiti, he tries to make the new, basically Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Right, that he would like instead. This is a reform. He has this great empire that stretches from Greece to Kenya. Right, very diverse population. Everybody with their own gods, and he says basically, can everybody put their stuff away? Put all your stuff away. Worship me, my queen, our children, our family. Let's start fresh from here. Doesn't work, right? The priests of Amun come back with a vengeance. And as a matter of fact, Nefertiti outlives Akhenaten, and she returns to Thebes. His wife returns from Thebes Her daughter is Queen T, who is now the wife or the mother of Tutankhaten, who is Akhenaten's son. And as they return to Thebes, they return to the old church and they return to Amun. And so Tutankhaten changes his name, or his mother, Nefertiti, changes his name to Tutankhamun, right? Now, an interesting thing about Tutankhamun is he marries, I believe, a woman named Queen T, right? T is related to Nefertiti and Tia and Te and Toya. But she's removed. And Tutankhamun takes on a different wife, an Asiatic wife. And once they are ousted, and the priests of Amun come back to, or Thebes returns control, and Akhenaten is put asunder or whatever, or is left. One of Tut's Asiatic princesses, and she may be Asiatic, maybe she's even from Kemet, but she sends 2 letters to the Hittites to send her a prince, and that together they could rule Egypt. That she is more or less believes she is the legitimate queen mother. She is the legitimate God's wife of Amun, and if I can get your military support, we could run this. Now, on the other hand, she's calling out for the Hittites. So again, this tension between the north and the south is very, very, very intense, right? The other queen's God's wives of Amun have returned to the south. She is trying to make an alliance with a Hittite prince from the north. The first letter goes unanswered. The Hittites are like, I don't think so. We're not coming down there causing trouble. We are subject to the empire and don't want to start stuff. She sends another letter. She says, you know what? It's ripe for the taking. So if you send me a Hittite prince, he and I can rule from the north up in the delta. We can rule the basically Levant, Asia Minor, the Aegean Peninsula. We can rule from there and then rule all the way down the south from the gold mines of Nubia, the wonders out of Punt, etc. Well, the letter is intercepted. We believe Horemheb, who becomes the leader or the establisher of the 19th dynasty, intercepts either the letter or the prince, and he's done away with, and so is this princess. And so we have Horemheb coming up again from the south to reunite. Horemheb was never down with the Atan. He was always down with the priests of Amun. He was a military general, and we know that the military throughout Egyptian history, or at least antiquity, was dominated by Nubians. And so they come up once again up from the south to attach Lower Egypt, or the north, to the empire. Horemheb sets forth a whole bunch of laws and penalties to stop corruption and crime and things like that. We're going to talk about that in our next episode, talking about law enforcement in the Nile Valley. And after Horemheb establishes himself, or establishes the 19th dynasty, and control again over the whole of Kemet from Greece to Kenya, Ramses II becomes the next famous ruler. And he rules for an amazing 60-some years. His principal wife, Nefertari, another god's wife, rules with him for at least 30 years. And we note that they create this enormous statue. So if you go down to see Abu Simbel, the great statues of that king and queen sat together equally. We note that it's put in the south. It's put in Nubia because they're basically worshipped as god and goddess. They carry on the pharaonic tradition, while the north seems to be following other traditions, and will show that this cult of Isis seems to be a threat to the cult of, or the Church of Amun. So 19th dynasty, we have Nefertari, again, this great god's wife who seems to be on equal par with her husband, that and basically co-regent or the ruler of the South, or at least authority to rule the South, goes through her. You can't that again, but that causes problem for the North. It would seem the Asiatics can't follow a queen, while Africans must follow a queen. In Lower Egypt, the cataract between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt becomes the split. So Ramses rules for over 60 years. And you could imagine somebody with that long a rule, he gets to kind of change a lot of the games, because a lot of Nefertari dies way before him. He gets to take other wives. All the priests of Amun, he outlives so much, and he's so powerful that he gets to change the game a little bit. And again, he starts to name his queens as the god's wife of Amun, even though they're ruling from up north. And after a while, the African South starts to say, I don't think she's really down with Amun. I think this is really someone you're installing from the north to basically subjugate us. So after Egypt, the 19th dynasty falls apart. The 20th dynasty reasserts itself over Egypt, the north and south, but the capital is moved to the north. And here we have the epitome of power of the gods' wives of Amun, in that Queen T, and I guess we believe this is the second Queen T, leads what's called the harem conspiracy, where she and the Nubian leader of the army conspire to assassinate Ramses III and take the crown. And we note that on the one hand, she's tried, or the people who were part of the conspiracy were tried and executed. So it's not clear. We believe that Ramses III was killed, but at the same time, it does seem that the conspirators were caught, that authority to run the Lower Egypt did not pass to Upper Egypt, that we had a split in the 21st, 22nd, 23rd dynasties, and that a woman named Isis, that Ramses the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, that they appointed the family of a woman named Isert, who becomes Isis, as the queen mother of the north, while we have T and others, Mut, being establishing themselves as queen mothers of the south. And so the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, and even 24th dynasties are again split between Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, until we have, right, the 25th dynasty that marches up from the south, marches up from Nubia, and takes over the whole land. They rule from Napata, and it's interesting that the royal sisters of Piagi, the god's wife of Amun, is the regent of the upper and lower Egypt. So again, these god's wives of Amun, beyond just female pharaohs, there were these women, queen mothers, Big Mama, the one who is basically, we're all more or less working for, as far as this society, this epitome of the nation is this queen mother. It's almost as if, I guess to give a modern example, is if, let's say, President Barack Obama is well respected in and outside the community, not by everybody, not lionized or whatever, but nobody has a bad word to say about Michelle Obama. And it would be as if Michelle Obama were appointed, or as God's wife of Amun, as the queen of Black America, and folks followed her advice, or your lives are dedicated to pleasing or making the queen proud of you and enlarging her estate, which you would see also as your estate, right? As the queen goes, so goes you, right? That's our affection for the church, or affection for the Black church. So again, this idea of a God's wife of Amun, to me, is most clear if we were to argue right now that that Black folks in America need some type of leadership, and that although we do not control the state, we can control the religious aspects of our life, or combine the social religious aspects of our lives underneath a queen mother, Michelle or whomever, right? Aretha Franklin, Erica Badu. I'm just being a little silly right here, but I'm serious in the idea that African might, African expansion and control over trade, over taxes, over greatness, over the empire was at its peak when these gods, wives of Ammon, when these queen mothers were venerated and praised by the majority of black Africans at the time, as opposed to the Mediterranean North. So we're going to stop here. When we're talking about matrilineality, it's going to come up again because when we shift over to Nubia, we're going to again talk about the queen mothers, elections, impeachment. Was Ramses III impeached? Was that the plan? It may have been characterized as a crime by the North, but to the South, was this a legitimate impeachment? We'll talk about that when it comes to Nubia. So we'll talk about matrilineality again, but the very next episode, episode 8, we're going to talk about African commitment to equal protection in crime. And the reason I'm going to do that off of this piece is because I want to delve back into that harem conspiracy and the trials that occurred with respect to prosecuting those suspects and the punishment, because it's a great jumping off point to talk about how law was enforced in ancient Kemet. We're going to talk about the police force, which we know was majority Nubian, usually related to the army, how they had trained dogs. They'd have trained monkeys grabbing you, holding onto your leg while the police come to get you. About the confluence of tort and crime, about the duty to report crime. We see in the harem conspiracy, if you didn't report the crime and you are aware of it, you're guilty of a crime yourself. We know that in the New Kingdom, we had courts with professional judges, that they were trained up to be judges. We impaneled juries. There was a burden of proof. People had to be convicted on testimony. Then we'll talk about the punishments that seem to be available, beatings, wounds, expulsion, prisons, which is a very controversial subject when we talk about Africa, whether there were or were not prisons. We'll talk about the regularity, especially with equal protection, government corruption, and how crime committed by government officials is heightened, and the punishments thereof heightened, instead of today where corruption by government officials it goes unpunished, or at least punished less than when it's typical individuals. Again, when we talk about this harem conspiracy, it also invokes this idea there were trials of tomb raiders. And it suggests here that the tomb raiders were not just people searching for wealth, which I'm sure a lot of them were, but it would seem that a lot of the tomb raiders were priests and people related to Ammon, who believed that through the Aten, through the cult of Isis, through other machinations, that the North or Lower Egypt was no longer really down with the crew, and that although the pyramids and all that were technically in Lower Egypt, that we needed to basically get the old school pharaohs and their goods and stuff and bring it back down to the south. It's a really interesting take on tomb raidings when we talk about this African North versus the Mediterranean South. Lastly, we'll talk about Pianki abolishing the death penalty in the 25th dynasty, after he comes up and conquers the whole of Egypt and the rest of the Levant and Syria, etc. But we're not quite sure how long that particularly lasts or all the motivations for it, but we'll explore it. So that's what we're going to do in episode 8. I hope you enjoyed our discussion, or learned a lot from our discussion in episode 7 about African matrilineality and precisely the gods, wives of Ammon, and how matrilineality, cultural unity, and all that also relates to the greatness of the state when it comes to the issuance and levying of taxes, and therefore the expenditure of those taxes on public works, on social goods and whatnot. So as we see you in a couple of days, while I leave you, I hope that you will go to Amazon Kindle and purchase my latest book, Taxes, Death, and Trouble: How Starving the Beast Tax Cuts Created the Black Lives Matter Movement. And also, my typical mantra, just to sign off and say, as a people, as black folks, as Afrocentric, as a pragmatic black nationalist, I advocate for all of us to better educate ourselves and our children, to start and patronize black businesses, to stop unduly criticizing each other so that we can accumulate human, financial, social, and political capital. Hotep.